Hi class, let me go over your notes from section 4.2 in Math 0404. This is Evaluate and Simplify Expressions. So your professor in statistics might have you computing the correlation coefficient formulas, the regression formulas using this format, but there's many different ways to do this. So let's learn how to do some arithmetic here and identify some symbols to be able to answer the question. So I'm going to go over part C, and your instructor might ask you to fill in the rest and complete the rest and upload onto Blackboard. So the first one, you have columns. We have X and Y values, and they represent the coordinates plotted on a point. Now, the third column asks you to multiply the column X and column Y, and the fourth column asks you to square just the X value, so it's X times X, right? Multiply X times X. And the last column asks you to multiply Y times Y. So let's do that for the first two rows here. And the first one is 2 times 9. So I'm going to write that, 2 times 9. So this answer is 18. If I square X value, make sure to put that in parentheses. If you square it, that's 4. 2 times 2 is 4. So this is this answer for that column. If I square the Y values, that would be 9 times 9. So that's 81. And circle that answer. So that's what would go in that second row. So fill in the first one. Try the first one on your own. Let's do the third row here with the negative sign here on the Y. So here I have 7 times negative 1. 7 times negative 1 is a negative 7. If I were to square the X value, that would be 7 squared. So 7 times 7 is 49. And the last one, if I were to square the Y, that would be negative 1 squared. Make sure to put that in parentheses. Negative 1 times a negative 1 is actually a positive 1. So don't forget the parentheses. All right, so fill in the rest of the tables. On the bottom here, they're asking you for a couple of symbols. So here, this represents the sum of that column. So if I were to add up everything in that first column, add up 5, the sum of the X values, if I were to add up 5 plus 2 plus 7 plus 1 plus 8, I end up with 10, 22, 23. So this sum is 23. So this sum of the X values would be 23. The second one is sum up all the Y values. So you have to add up everything in that column, and whatever you find here would be the sum of the Y values. What would be the sum of this column? Well, that's correct. I would have to add up everything found in this column after you're done multiplying all those rows, and everything in here would be the sum of X times Y. Then write that answer here. Do the same thing for this one and this one. This is the sum of X squared. This is the sum of Y squares. So whatever answers you get in those two spots are the answers for these two spots. But the last one, if you look closely, the last one is sigma of X quantity squared. So this squared is actually outside. So what does that mean? That means that we substitute the sum of the X values, which in this case is 23, and we square it, and we get that answer for that last part. So 23 times 23 gives you 529. So that's the answer for sigma of X quantity squared. So pay attention to this one also once you complete the sum of the Y values. All right, so I'm going to try, and part B asks you to count. So there's actually 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different data points. So I'm going to do C, which is the longest and most difficult. And after you do that, stay organized. You can do D, E, and F. So for part C, I'm going to move to this screen. So these are all my answers for the above, and they're color-coded here. If you want to take a screenshot or double-check your answers after you did all of that work. So for part C alone, we're looking for the correlation coefficient. So how do we do that? This is the n, so there's 5 data values, so that's how we get 5. So n is 5. Then it's the sum of x times y. Well, where do we find that? We find that over here, so that's 13. Then it's minus the sum of the x values. The sum of the x values is 23. Times the sum of the y values. The sum of the y values is 19. And then continue substituting. Don't start simplifying until everything is there. Stretch out the horizontal line there and write everything underneath. Don't put a slash and do a square root. That's too messy to keep track of all the steps. So make sure to put a clear numerator, clear denominator, so you don't get confused. So on the bottom we have square root of n. So again, n is 5. Then we have times sum of x squared, which we got 143. The sum of 143, that was in our table, minus the sum of x, which was 23, and we square that. Remember, we got 529 for this number, 529 for this number, so we can replace this with 529. Same thing for the second part. We have n, that's 5. The sum of y squares, that's 221, that's in our table. And then the sum of the y squared, once you have the sum of y's, that's 19 squared. And so 19 squared is 361. So we can replace this with 361. All right, so let's do the order of operations. Once you did all the substitution, multiply before we subtract. So let's do that on the top. 5 times 13 is 65. 23 times 19 is 437. Then we subtract and we get a negative on the numerator. Let's do the denominator. We have 5 times 143, that's 715, minus 23 squared, or 529. So 715 minus 529, subtract, and we get 186, but it's still inside the square root, so don't forget the square root. Times, now let's do the second parentheses. 5 times 221 is 1105. 19 squared is 361. Subtract those two and you get 744. Then take the square root. So when you take the square root, remember the numerator stays the same. The denominator, when you take the square root of 186, it's 13.63 and a couple of other decimals. Take the square root of 744 and it's 27.2763, and so forth. Now multiply the two bottom numbers, keep all the decimals, and you should get an exact value of 372. Now when you divide a negative 372 divided by, that's what that fraction bar means, by a positive 372, you get exactly a -1. So show all of this work, keep track of this, try to do this without the video once again, and complete the rest of the questions. Your instructor for Math 0404 may ask you to upload these onto Blackboard.